Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. When John Alexander Logan, pictured here, passed away after a brief and unexpected illness a day after Christmas in 1886, he left behind family, friends, a distinguished record as a Union Major General during the Civil War, and his work establishing Memorial Day. He also left behind a completed manuscript that paid tribute to the citizen soldier of the United States. The untimely demise of Logan, or Black Jack as he was known to his comrades for his dark eyes and complexion and jet black hair, might have resulted in his manuscript gathering dust on a shelf and never seeing the light of day. But his family stepped in and published it the next year with the title, The Volunteer Soldier of America. As I scanned the book searching for further information on his views about citizen soldiers, a curious and unexpected anecdote caught my attention. An account from the Atlanta campaign describing how, in the summer of 1864, Logan's 15th Corps advanced. Union soldiers in his command discovered a primitive log cabin partially destroyed by Federal cannon. An elderly lady appeared and began chatting with the soldiers. She eventually led them to a young woman who had just given birth to a baby girl. The soldiers named the babe Shell Anna. The story seemed too impossible to be true, but here it was in Logan's own book. Still, I was somewhat skeptical. Logan had passed before the book's publication. Anything could have snuck in. I went down the research rabbit hole to determine the veracity of this account. My first search led me to a book titled Kenyon's Wife. It's a novel written by Lucy Cecil White Lilly and published in 1887, the same year as Logan's book. It differed somewhat in the telling, and as part of a work of fiction, I came away more puzzled and perplexed. This version had originally been published in Lippincott's magazine in March 1887, 3 months before The Volunteer Soldier of America landed in bookstores. My second search led me to an 1892 book titled Camp and Field, Sketches of Army Life written by those who followed the flag. It was compiled by a man named Wilbur F. Hinman. This is essentially a collection of personal accounts and anecdotes by Union soldiers. On page 305 begins a story with a long title and subtitle. Born in a battle, Little Shell Anna, July 1864, General Logan becomes godfather, a true story that is stranger than fiction, by a member of the 15th Corps. Now, I believed I was onto the original story, and I also had the pseudonym of the author, a member of the 15th Corps. But I paused on the 1892 date. This is 5 years after the publication of Logan's book. So I went to newspapers.com, good old newspapers.com, and found the same version published in the July 10th, 1884 edition of the National Tribune, a Washington, D.C. newspaper for Civil War veterans. The motto is to care for him who has borne the battle and for his widow and orphans. This is a year before Logan's book was published. I believe at its core, it's a true story, though it could be embellished to some degree. Let me read it to you. It begins, during the summer of 1864, the army under Sherman had fallen back from its position before Atlanta and swept around to Hood's rear, General Logan leading the advance. We were not molested until we neared Flint River. There, the enemy had planted a masked battery, and as we approached, it inflated our line. You could scarce encounter more disagreeable companions than shot and shell, and the boys were not long in taking to the timber. General Logan at once ordered up a field battery of brass Napoleons and accepted the challenge for an artillery duel. There was nothing to direct the fire of our gunners save the white puffs of smoke, but they soon silenced the rebel cannon and cleared the way for the column. We then rode forward again. Just as we turned a bend in the road, we emerged suddenly into a small clearing. A rude log cabin stood in the clearing, and hanging from one of the bushes, we noticed a yellow cloth. It naturally occurred to us that this was an improvised hospital, and we rode up to inquire. At the door of the cabin, an old woman, evidently of the cracker type, presented herself, but on seeing that we were Yankees, beat a hasty retreat. We were not disposed to be so easily baffled, and, calling her out, began to ply her with questions. She told us there wasn't no wounded men thar, and when asked why she'd put out a yellow flag, replied, "Well, you see, my gal is sick, and I reckoned if I put out that your rag, humans wouldn't be pestering around." "What's the matter with your child?" said I. "We're medical officers." "Well, now," she responded, "if humans is real doctors, just look in and see. Time my gal was sickest, two of urine shells came clear through my cabin, and I tell you, it was right scary for a spell." We accepted the invitation and walked in. The cabin, built of rough pine logs, afforded but one room about 12 feet square. A small log meat house was the only outbuilding, the cow stable having been knocked to pieces by our shells, except a small bark-thatched lean-to in which we found a loom containing a partially completed web of coarse cotton homespun. Aside from this loom, the only household articles were an old skillet, a dilapidated bed, 2 or 3 chairs without backs, and a queer collection of gourds. The shells had indeed played havoc with the interior. The roof had been badly shattered, and a stray shot had pierced the walls. It had cut one of the logs in two and forced one jagged end out into the room so that it hung threateningly over the bed, upon which we saw a young girl, by whose side was a babe just born. It was a touching spectacle. Here, in this lonely cabin, stripped by lawless stragglers of both armies of food and clothing, and shattered by the flying shells of artillery in the storm and fury of battle, had been born this sweet innocent. The mother was the wife of a Confederate soldier whose blood had stained the sacred soil of Virginia but a few months after marriage, and the child was fatherless. The babe was still in its own innocence, but the writer with his jackknife cut from the unfinished web in the old loom a piece of coarse homespun in which it was soon deftly swaddled. Fortunately, we had our hospital knapsacks with us, and we did all that our limited stores permitted to relieve the wants of the young mother and child. But by this time, quite a number of officers had gathered about the cabin, and they amused themselves by listening to the old lady's account of the stirring incident. One of the officers had, in fact, given her some stored tobacco, with which she had filled a cob pipe, and the fact that she was spitting through her teeth with such accuracy as to hit a fly at 10 paces 9 times out of 10 showed she was enjoying herself after the true cracker style. Presently, someone suggested that the baby ought to be christened, and it being duly explained to her, she replied, "Oh yes, baptized, I reckon, if Ewins has got any preacher along." This was all the boys wanted, and an orderly was at once sent back with the compliments of the surgeon, requesting that a chaplain might be allowed to return with the messenger. The general, Logan, asked the orderly for what purpose a chaplain was wanted, and the orderly replied that the doctors were going to have a baptism. Upon this, General Logan, for it was he, significantly remarked that the names mentioned were sufficient to satisfy him that some deviltry was at hand, but that the chaplain might go. Then, inviting the colonel, who happened to be riding with him, he set out himself for the scene and soon joined the party at the cabin. "General," said the doctor, "you were just the man we're after." "For what?" "For a godfather," replied the doctor. "Godfather to what?" demanded the general. The matter was explained, and as the doctor led the way into the house, the boys noticed there was something in Blackjack's face that they were not wont to see there, and that in his eyes there was a humid tenderness far different from their usual flashing brightness. He stood for a moment silent, gazing at the mother and fatherless child and their pitiful surroundings, and turning to those about him said tersely, "That looks rough." Glancing around the ruins wrought by our shells, he called out, "I say, boys, can't you straighten this up a little? Fix up that roof. There are plenty of stakes around that old stable. Push back that log into place. Help the old lady to clear out the litter. And I don't think it would hurt you any to leave a part of your rations. The boys leaned their muskets up against the logs, and while some cut brush, others swept up the splinters and pine knots that the shot and shell had strewn over the floor, and not one of them forgot to go to the corner of the cabin and empty his haversack. It made a pile of commissary stores consisting of meat, coffee, sugar, hardtack, and chickens foraged from her next door neighbor, surpassing any that this poor cracker woman had probably ever seen. This done, the next thing was the christening, and the chaplain came forward to perform his sacred office. What are you going to give her for a name? I want something right pert now, said grandmother. She was told that the name should be satisfactory, and forthwith she brought out the baptismal bowl, a gourd, full of fresh water from the spring. General Logan now took the baby, wrapped it in its swaddling clothes of homespun, and held it while the chaplain went through with the ceremony. The latter was brief and solemn, the spectators behaving with becoming reverence, and the battle-born babe was christened Shellanna. The party now turned to leave the cabin and resume the march when General Logan, taking a gold coin from his pocket, a coin that he had carried as his pocket piece for many a day, presented it to the old lady as a christening gift for his godchild. And the officers and men added one by one a greenback until the sum was swelled to an even greater than this brave-hearted cracker had ever handled. Before parting, the general cautioned her to put the money in a safe place, lest some bummer should steal it in spite of everything, and then, ordering a guard to be kept over her cabin until the last straggler had passed, he rode away. The old lady's goodbye was, well, them thar Yanks is the beatin'est critters I ever seen. So there you have the unusual anecdote of General Logan, an old lady in the cabin in the woods near Flint River during the Atlanta campaign in July of 1864, and the birth of a baby christened Shellanna. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.